Please join me now in welcoming Tim to explain how all of this is unfolding at DSM.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction. So good morning, everybody. And I have to say I'm delighted to be here to be able to talk to you this morning. My name is Tim Tolhurst, and I'm the Chief Purchasing Officer for DSM, and very proud to have that privilege. And I've been with the company now for 4 years, since 2010. Just a little bit of background on myself. I was with a company called Firmenich before in Switzerland, a flavor and fragrance company. And before that, I worked for ICI, I worked for Mars, I worked for SmithKline Beecham. And in all that time, I've been in the buying game. So I've been a buyer for some 30 years. And I think, as the two previous presenters have said, I've seen procurement going through a sort of massive transformation in reinventing itself. And it really has gone from a very operational, tactical organization to now very much a value-driving strategic organization, which is helping companies achieve their enterprise goals. I heard somebody once say that with the transformation of procurement, it's gone from the graveyard to the front yard. And and I feel that way, actually. I feel that if I look at what's taken place in procurement over those years, it very much is along the lines of those stories. I personally still get a tremendous amount of energy out of where does the supplier base meet the enterprise, and how do you really look to bring value from the supplier base through to the company. So this morning, what I wanted to do was just take 2 slides to talk a little bit about DSM, who we are and what we represent, and then a couple more slides just to describe purchasing as a whole within DSM as a company. But then really zero in on the global indirect purchasing organization within DSM and this transformation journey that we've been on. And how did we arrive at this differentiated value proposition? How do we see performance management and the ability to really understand and measure the performance of spend? And how did that enable us to move into the area of spend demand? Where are we now in terms of decomplexing our organization and thinking about moving into these game-changing initiatives? And then lastly, to try and show you a picture of the future, which is where we would like to be in 2016 at the end of our strategic plan period in terms of the capabilities and the competencies that we want from the organization. So start with DSM. I mean, DSM is a complex company, and I think it takes about 3 years to really get to know DSM when you work for it. And it's a very old company. So it started off in mining, in fact. DSM stands for Dutch State Mines. But as a company, it has itself been through an enormous transformation. It came out of the mines into agrochemicals, and then at some point in its history, it moved into bulk commodity chemicals. And then it moved down the value chain towards specialty chemicals. And recently, it's emerged as a life science and material science platform. And in our life science business, we have nutrition, and we have food specialties. In our material science platform, we have strong fibers, fiber intermediates, resins, and engineering plastics. And then more recently, DSM has moved into the bio-based economy, so that's our next step. And we have 2 what we call emerging businesses. One is in biomedical products and services, and the other one is in biofuels, but second-generation biofuels, which is not competing with the feed system. And so before I move on, I mean, DSM is a company which is completely believing in sustainability. It is a core value of the company, and it shows up in everything that we do. And we're very proud of that and how that, therefore, influences the transformation of the organization. So DSM operates in 200 locations in all continents across the world. We have about 23,000 people worldwide. In terms of sales, our sales are north of 9 billion, towards 9.5 billion. And in terms of spend, just to share the spend with you, we spend in the markets about 6.2 billion each year. 4 billion of that is on direct materials, and 2 billion of that is on indirect goods and services. Talk a little bit about purchasing. I think it's already been said this morning. If you look at our mission, we think the mission of the purchasing function within DSM is to really connect the supply markets to bring solutions to support our customers to help us win in our marketplace. And, you know, for me, this is no longer just about how do you ensure best value, quality, price, how do you make sure that you've got good risk management strategies in place. But I think all procurement organizations now are compelled to really think about how do you extend the value proposition. And for us, when we think about that, we think about innovation from suppliers. How do you really connect to the innovation capabilities of your supplier base? About sustainability, do your suppliers practice sustainability in their own supply chains, and do they bring sustainable solutions? And then this area of asset light. Asset light is this idea that in order for us to grow, how do we get access to supplier capital and supplier competencies, which helps us grow in scale of a business without necessarily increasing mass in our assets? I mean, I think one of the challenges for us as a company is we have a huge asset base, and we need to find ways of being able to grow the company without necessarily having to continually increase that asset base. So what's required to do this? I think more and more, I think if you're a professional procurement organization, you need to have in-depth, intimate knowledge of your supply markets. I think also you need to really think about where is the value coming from our spend? How do we segment that spend in a better way? And where we want to do business with suppliers that we feel that we can trust and build relationships with, then how do we become much more collaborative with them and really build meaningful long-term relationships which deliver in this area of innovation, sustainability, and asset light? And then lastly, how do you bring those supplier capabilities to DSM in an efficient and transparent way? How do you standardize on your processes? How do you use smart, intelligent tooling and infrastructure to really make sure that the organization is not just effective in the way that it operates and manages spend, but it's efficient in the way that it does that as well? And I think maybe that's what the couple of days are about. So back in 2010, when I joined the company, we put together a strategy called Beyond Savings, the next evolution in value creation. And what we tried to do as a purchasing leadership team was say, what do we think we need to do in procurement over the period between 2010 and 2016? How do we set out a vision, and what are our strategic goals and objectives that really mean that the value delivered by procurement is going to help the enterprise win? And we did that at the same time as DSM as a company as a whole was developing its own strategy. So clearly it was important for us to make sure that we aligned our goals and our objectives and our plans so that they were supporting the business objectives and goals in themselves. And it became apparent to us in that this period of intense leverage, which buyers have relied upon as a mechanism to continue to secure value from suppliers, is or will come to an end. You know, the supply markets are shifting, and you can no longer rely on what we call the qualifiers here as the basis upon which procurement operates. You have to think about how do you extend that value proposition to include values, as I said, in the areas of innovation, sustainability, and for us, asset light. They are the three sort of extended value propositions that we look for today from our supplier base to help us succeed. And so now 4 years in, we have sort of, in innovation, we have 100 innovation projects in the company where suppliers are either contributing or even in some cases leading innovation, in the company to help us win in our markets. On sustainability, when I joined, although DSM has been number 1 or number 2 in the Dow Jones Sustainability Index for a long time, when you looked at the supply side, it was measured at needs improvement. And through the efforts that we've invested in really trying to bring sustainability to the supplier base, we are now a leading practitioner in supply chain sustainability. And last, in this asset light area, I mean, this is more difficult because international accounting standards and IFRS don't make it easy. But we have been able to bring suppliers to the coalface of DSM, and we now have 5 or 6 major projects involved in renewable energy, in waste and water management, where suppliers are bringing their capital and their competencies to help us develop our business. At the same time, if you look at the fundamentals, I think, again, it was said this morning, in a buyer's market, I think buyers in the past have been preoccupied at facing out to the supplier base, and they put a lot of energy in their activities in how do we leverage that supplier base to get value. But with these changing markets and this shift in dynamics, I think the procurement organization also needs to bring the supplier base into contact with the company in a much more meaningful and much more expansive way. And so we spent a lot of time developing and building our relationships and our reputation and our networks with our internal business partners, and really trying to create a flow of exchange between our supplier base and our internal business partners. And then lastly, but not least, in terms of people and capabilities, I think that an organization marches on the strength of its people. And so we put a huge amount of juice into developing the people, the professionalism, the discipline, the analytical and fact-based capabilities, so that the horsepower and the punching power of our organization today is fundamentally different from where it was 4 years ago. And today, I'm very proud to say that 70% of the total spend is managed under strategic sourcing methodologies, where we clearly have set out a plan to manage the spend over the coming years. Just touching, excuse me a second. So just touching on the organization, so I'm the CPO, and in my organization, I have an HR function. We have finance and control. And in 2011, we started a group called Functional Excellence. And Functional Excellence is about how do we continue to build these competencies and drive this professionalism. And we've developed what we think is a very powerful toolbox where the Functional Excellence organization works alongside the spend areas and the category managers, really to help them build and develop their horsepower and their professionalism. At the same time, we have the BG purchasing organization, so they're responsible for largely managing the direct material spend. And in fact, if you look at the DSM spend, there's not a huge overlap between one of our business groups and another in terms of spend or in terms of supplier base. But we do have a direct sourcing organization where we have centers of expertise working alongside the business groups to make sure that where we can leverage spend across multiple business groups, that we do that in the most effective way. At the same time, we have a purchasing shared service center. So in this transformation journey, we've separated out the whole P2P and transaction processes away from sourcing. And then lastly, we have this global indirect spend organization, which is where we're going to zero in today. So again, back in 2010, at the time when I joined as the CPO, my predecessor had brought a transformation program to the table, and we were just about to go live with this project called Close the Loop. And for a conservative, consensus-based Dutch company, there was no lacking ambition in this program. It was about how do we bring all of this indirect fragmented spend, which is managed in a very disparate way across the organization, together under one global center-led organization. And the ambition was 100% of the spend, 100% of the transactions, everywhere in the world of DSM, with 100% of the people transferring to this new organization, and for us to implement SRM as the transaction platform at the same time over a period of 2 years. And I kind of wondered if my CPO previous guy had set me up, because as I came in, I looked at this and I thought, actually on reflection, I actually thought, you know, as a CPO, I'm not sure that I would design this program. Yeah, I may have come at it in a different way. And when I looked at the fundamentals of all of this, I could see that there were key positions in the organization were missing, parts of the process weren't particularly well defined. And quite honestly, I thought this thing could turn into a huge train crash inside our organization. But I have to say, for me, I mean, it's miraculous that we were able to sort of get our hands around this and anchor this and stabilize this and bring it to the business. And it's been a fantastic experience to be part of this transformation of this area of real sort of unmanaged spend and bringing it into what we would now consider to be a professional, disciplined, you know, fact-based organization, which is really delivering value to the company. And so I'd like to actually, while I'm here, just show my appreciation or state my appreciation to all the people that have been involved in that and the extraordinary effort that they put in order to help make that happen. So if you look at the landscape today, I mean, clearly we spend $2 billion on indirect services. And as I said, part of building the foundations for the indirect effort was to roll out SRM across the whole of the DSM network, where it made economic sense. And we're really proud within the procurement organization that today, inside DSM, we have by a country mile the single biggest, single instance IT platform enabled across the whole of the company. No other part of DSM has that, and can claim that kind of success. And that's been the foundations upon which we then built out the rest of our procurement program, indirect procurement program, to the extent today where we have 90% of the spend transparent to us and under management. In my previous life as a CPO, when I look at non-production or indirect spend, I don't think the spend coverage has ever been at the level of 90%. We also have 90% PO compliance, which means that we're raising orders actually before the spend happens and not trying to match the order to the invoice once the order's gone through the system. And at the same time, on contract compliance, we measured contract compliance as a baseline to start with, and we were at 18%. And today, our contract compliance is as high as 60%. And if you think about that, what a significant transformation that is, that now 60% of the spend goes to the vendors that we intended and goes out on the contracts that we agreed. We've also put a huge amount of energy and effort into the whole system around performance management. And I'm going to come back to that in a little while. But within our business warehouse, in terms of the specificity, the granularity of our spend, the accuracy of our spend, and our master data, we've really invested in making sure that we're able to monitor and measure the performance of that spend and bringing that back in a meaningful way. And then lastly, and I think, again, this is a great credit to DSM, to the organization, throughout this transformation period, in addition to doing all these things, we've been able to maintain our savings run rate at 7% in 2010, 2011, 2012, and 2013. So that's a fantastic performance. If you think about it from a business case, I was recently asked to give feedback to the managing board. Prior to this, we were operating at the sort of 2 to 3% level in indirect in this very fragmented organization. And if you take 7% on $2 billion and think about what that's worth, it means that we've delivered over these 4 years in excess of $250 million in additional benefits to the company as a result of moving through this transformation. I think one factor, and I was sharing this last night and got some sort of fairly staggering remarks, we still have a supplier base of 45,000 active suppliers. I think Marcel said to me, he said, Tim, you should get a gold medal for that. If the number of suppliers is the measure of success, then you're certainly in the upper quartile division. And I think that is a challenge for us. I mean, we haven't actually had a structured program to look at how do we rationalize suppliers. So we've done all of this with this hugely complex supplier base. But I think if we're really going to make progress in the future and move to the next level, at a certain moment, we have to accept the fact that we need to halve the size of the supplier base as a first measure and then work from that point. But nevertheless, I think what we've achieved and where we are today really is, as I said, it's an outstanding performance. I mean, one of the success factors that we came to very early on is it's very important how you set the organization up and how that organization operates. And so there we saw a distinction, if you like, between category management and how do we make sure that category management group stays close to the business. So we have a multi-layered organization there. We have site buyers in the big sites. We have a hub structure, which we've deployed across the world. So we have 4 hubs, one in North America, one in Asia Pacific in Shanghai, one in the Rhine Valley, and one in the center of the universe, which is Sittard in the Netherlands. And so those hub structures work to support the buyers. And then we have these regional category managers who are responsible for enabling and realizing the benefits of our sourcing strategies. And then we have these global category managers on top of that who are really shaping the direction and the overarching strategy of how we see these clusters of spend. I think one of the learnings for us was we started out with this idea that we were going to drive everything towards global categories. But it wasn't long before we realized, in fact, that the supplier base doesn't really operate on a global scale. And whereas you need to set direction and agree the cluster strategies, the actual realization of the benefits and the execution of those plans takes place at a regional level. The other area where I really feel that we have made the difference for ourselves, and which I'm proud of, is that we've invested a lot of effort in building a business intelligence and supply market analyst organization. And we tend to use that as a bit of an entry role for bright young people coming from the universities who are IT savvy and internet savvy, who come in and really spend a lot of time looking at how are the supply markets developing and what's happening, because in support of the category managers, that provides insights that allows us to think about things differently. And to some extent, it creates a tension between our category managers who think they know everything and these young analysts and business intelligence people who are capable of actually challenging some of the fundamentals and keeping that machine sort of working in a sort of very vibrant way. So on the left-hand side, what we did is we set up purchasing shared service centers around the world. So again, we have one in North America, we have one in Asia, we have 2 operating inside Europe. And there, that's all about how do we drive the efficient transaction? How do we take a group of people and put them in an environment where really you're looking to drive the efficiency of the machine? And so we've made that distinct separation. And the other role, which is extremely important for us, is the role of the contract manager. Because the contract manager is the glue, if you like, that connects the sourcing cycle to the P2P cycle in terms of contract compliance, contract management, supplier performance management. And so this is the way that we set the organization up, distinguishing between those parts that you need to keep very close to the business and you need to maintain that intimacy at the business phase. At the same time, then how do you actually make the transaction organization a highly efficient factory-type machine? This slide you can't read, but I was talking about performance management. So we have put a huge amount of energy into the whole subject of performance and spend management. And there, today, not just from SRM, but also from all the legacy systems, we now have a business warehouse where we really are able to, as I said, understand our spend and can take that back right down to the cost center level in our organization in terms of the overall purchasing performance, operating working capital, CapEx, but also the EBITDA relevant element. And how does that anchor itself back into the P&Ls of the different business organizations? And I don't think we appreciate at the time, but this has been a tremendous enabler for the way that purchasing can operate and work with the business groups. It means that we can have a completely different set of discussions with the businesses about the way they spend the money, where they spend the money, how they spend the money, who in the organization spends it. But also, where is the value of indirect purchasing? Where is this professionalism and this discipline? Where is this analytical, fact-based sort of outcomes showing up? And how can they see that in their organizations? So when I started out, as I took over the role and we had put this whole close-the-loop program together, as I went around and met the business leaders, I would meet many of them that said, look, we don't really understand what this indirect purchasing thing is all about. You know, you seem to have a big organization, costs a lot of money, but where's the value coming from and what are they doing? You know, and what I can say 4 years later, as a result of being able to firstly drive the professionalism and performance of the organization, but secondly be able to bring that back to the business groups. Now the value proposition of our indirect purchasing organization is undisputed across the company, from the managing board through the business leaders right down to the level of the operational managers. And that's created a lot of space for us to operate, because suddenly we're an organization that can be relied upon. We're an organization which is seen to bring distinct insights and professional value to help all of the budget holders, you know, secure their targets. What is amazing for me, in fact, in all the time that I've been a CPO, there's been this discussion about how does procurement move from the spend side to get involved in the demand side of the expenses and how those expenses develop. And in 2013, as our company came under more pressure, as we came under pressure to deliver our commitments to the marketplace and to deliver our financial goals in increasing economic headwinds, we were asked by the managing board whether we could, in fact, engage with the business leaders and with the big service units to have a conversation about how we might reduce the flow of expenses from the company. Could we, for a period of time, to help the enterprise achieve its goals, turn the cash valves down in a way which did not hurt the business? And so through this performance management and through our ability to understand and dissect our spend, we were able to look at spend from, is it essential or non-essential? Is it complex or less complex? And we sort of entered into these discussions with the finance organizations and with the leadership organizations to say, look, if we were more cost conscious, if we were a little bit more sort of discerning and prudent about how we spend our money, is there an opportunity for us, in fact, to turn down the flow of the cash going out of the business? And over 2013, what you saw was the expense development inside the company went down significantly. And even though we had a bigger business footprint in 2013, we actually spent $100 million less on expenses as a result of really seeing how we could turn these cash valves down. And the interesting thing for me is that it was the first time a procurement organization can enter into a discussion with the business groups and have a meaningful discussion around how their money gets spent without being seen to step over the line and become the policeman of the enterprise. Because I think that any procurement organization that sets itself up as a policeman of how the business spends its money really is on a hiding to nothing. And so this has been a fantastic experience for us. And what we can see, in fact, is as we go into 2014, that spend has structurally reduced. That this level of awareness and this level of attention to how do we manage our costs has really become more embedded in the organization, and that structurally our expense base has reduced. What we also did over that period, in 2013, was we were reporting back to the business leadership and the management board on how the spend was developing at the level of the total indirect spend, but also in areas like professional services. How was the company using professional services? In the areas like travel and entertainment, of course, because that always gets attention. But also in the areas of facilities, goods, and services. How was the spend developing? And we were doing that based on closing the month end and looking back at the invoices to determine what was the spend trend. But again, as a result of this continued desire to improve the whole performance management space, over the back end of 2013, we were able to develop our capabilities to report purchase orders committed in the month. So now, in addition to reporting as a lagging indicator, expenses after the month, we're actually showing the business leadership on a 20-day cycle how they are committing their expenses, and obviously the correlation between the purchase order value and the expenses that result afterwards. And I think that really has sort of sealed the transformation, if you like, for the indirect procurement, because I think now it's kind of repositioned the procurement organization as really helping the company to achieve its enterprise goals, not just in professionalism around the way we manage the spend, but also our ability to talk to the business groups about how is that spend developing and having a real conversation about the demand side of our expense base. So where does that bring us? I think where it brings us, if I look back in 2010 on this maturity curve, back then we started off as this very sort of fragmented and sort of disparate organization. And through this effort, I think that we've really accelerated the indirect organization to a point now where it's undisputed value adding. And then together with this functional excellence organization that we built, which is now driving the powerhouse of our machine, and with all the projects and programs that we have and the momentum that we've achieved and the reputation and the credibility that we've established, I think that onward journey to becoming a leading practitioner is clearly on the landscape for us. So I put this slide in because it says, where do we go in the future? And so there's a lot of content in the slide, but I thought I'd maybe just take a couple of minutes to describe it. So when we did this strategy back in 2010, we tried to say, how is these megatrends and the macroeconomic factors going to affect the supply base of the future? How do we anticipate that, and how do we plan for the future? And how do we make sure that we're developing and adapting our organization so that it's equipped to deal with the kind of pressures that we're going to face into? And our overriding conclusion on that was that the supply markets are going to come under extreme pressure. If you look at the macroeconomic factors, I mean, the population of the world is growing towards 9 billion by 2050. I mean, there was some debate about China, but it would appear that the Chinese GDP is still at 7.5% and will be there and remain there for 10 years. And think about the demand that they're placing on the world's resources. You see the rise in the middle classes. You see what's going on in the US at the moment. I mean, anybody that goes to the US can only be infected by the enthusiasm and the sort of whole sentiment of the energy boom that's taking place and the rise of shale gas. And at the same time, on the other side, if you look at how the markets are behaving following this global economic crisis, there's a lot of adversity and a lot of cautiousness about introducing new capacity. There's a shortage of capital in the marketplace as a whole. And what we saw most of all, not just in our own business, but I think in industry and certainly in our supplier base, is that suppliers are far more cautious now and far more focused on the fact that margin management is as important as selling out on the top line. I've worked for a whole load of CEOs in my time that have said, if you get the top line in, everything else will fall into place. And I think in a market where it's oversupplied and there isn't pressure on your input costs, there is a possibility that can happen. But what the global financial crisis proved was that those organizations that weren't paying attention to their margins and really managing the margins were the ones that came under the most pressure. And so the combination of those factors altogether means, in my view, there simply is not enough to go around. And I was struck by a remark by our CEO, Feike Sijbesma. He was talking to Davos at the Economic Forum, and he made a statement. He said, that 75% of the world's resources are consumed by 5% of the population. And if you think about that, that is not sustainable. It's not sustainable in an environment where these new economies are growing and demanding their share of the spoils. And so I think we live in a society today, and I think that's why sustainability is so important to an organization, where we have to come to the conclusion that we need to do more with what we have, and we need to do more for less. And I think really that's the only way forward. So how is this then going to manifest itself in the supply markets? I think that the supply markets are going to come under enormous pressure. And I think we're going to see the kind of inflationary pressure in the supply markets that buyers have never had to deal with before. The buyer's language is plus or minus 5%. But even now in some of these base commodities and base services, you see inflationary pressure at the language of 15 to 20%. And that's a language that buyers can't deal with. So, from our standpoint, how do we see that in terms of our own indirect organization? Firstly, I think we need to do this drive for continued professionalism. As the very core of what we do, we need to drive up the professional standards and raise the brand of purchasing and really position it as a strategic function. Second challenge for us is how do you scale your organization to adapt to the changing spend? If you're divesting and you're acquiring, or your business center of gravity is moving towards the high-growth economies, how do you make sure that you build an organization which is made up of the people with the right skills in the right place at the right time, with diversity, with inclusion as one of the core essences of how that organization operates? So how do you scale your organization to breathe alongside the organization to make sure that it stays relevant to what you're trying to achieve? At the same time, this idea about driving business intelligence and driving supply market insights and driving knowledge and how the knowledge systems really work, not just for the procurement organization, but for the business as a whole. How do you get the business more alert to what's taking place in the supply markets? If you spend $6.2 billion on sales of $9.5 million, it is not irrelevant how the supply markets are going to perform and how that's going to affect your company. We're definitely of the view that you cannot continue to maintain 7% sort of outcomes if your primary strategy is, sort of leveraging the supplier base. And so the other thought that we have is how do we move our efforts towards what we call these game-changing initiatives? How do we challenge the business models? How do we come up with disruptive strategies? How do we think about changing the fundamentals of the cost components that go into the services and goods that we buy? And those kind of relationships are very complex, and they take time, and you have to try them and feel them and grow them and build them. If I look at some of these asset-light programs that we have, they took 3 years to really get them to where they are today. And that takes a lot of resources, and you need to give that area of focus proper attention. So the third area for us is how do we decomplex our organization? How do we make sure that the relationship between the cost of the organization and the spend that we have and the value that we create is in the right place? And there, it's not just about halving the size of the supplier base, but it's about how do we make sure that our contract management processes are in place, the contract lifecycle management, so we're able to proactively respond, the supplier development programs, supplier relationship programs. How do we make sure that at the end of the day, also, probably more importantly, we segment the spend and we drive the utility and or commodity type spend towards this automated transaction platform. So talking about the infrastructure, we said, you know, it really it's not the tool that is the goal. What we don't want to do is we don't want to put in procurement tooling which simply serves to meet the current needs. What we want to do is think about how do we design tooling and how do we bring our processes to a level where it enables our ambitions and what we're trying to achieve in the future. And for me, I think that there are three key themes to that. One is around this idea of knowledge management. How do you retain knowledge? How do you share knowledge? And therefore, in your organization, how do you multiply your capabilities? I think all of us in business face this issue of compliance and risk management. And so how do we make sure that that's in place? And then finally, this idea about more efficient processes in order for us to liberate resources so that we can focus on the game-changing plans. So this was the landscape that we had at the start of 2010 in terms of the different elements of infrastructure and tooling that we looked at. And obviously, we started out with Business Warehouse, and how do we build a strong Business Warehouse? We have a good master database in terms of SAP MDP, but we're currently in the process of transitioning to QMDM as a global master database for DSM. And then this business intelligence, we have a number of projects under what we call a SHAPE program. How do we bring business intelligence through? The implementation of SRM as the basic foundation upon which we build out indirect, where we've now got to 72% of all our spend, and we think saturation is around 80%. And where we are today, of course, is now with Ariba looking at how do we go upstream and look at all the procurement tooling. And then finally, this idea about e-connectivity. How do we get into the e-connectivity place, and how do we make sure that we integrate that to the overall infrastructure backbone? So this is my last slide, which is how do we see, therefore, the picture of the future? So 2013 is where we are now in terms of the competencies and capabilities. And where would we like to be in 2016? So firstly, we'd like to see Ariba as an integrated buying platform, 50% decrease in our supplier base, 65% of all of our spend is going through automated transactions. We really want this idea of value adding on the purchasing skills base. Also the idea of anchoring sustainability and innovation from suppliers in the way that we work and the way we do business. Full ownership of the whole contracting process, and how do we set up contracts and contract libraries and clauses. And then finally, how do we use this business intelligence machine to drive this kind of game-changing thinking and make sure that we stay vital and fit for the future. So, thank you very much for your attention. And